The future of Russia is being defined by an institution that is cracking under pressure. The Kremlin runs on internal protection and a constant flow of liquid cash. However, it only works if the country remains completely synchronized with the plans dictated by Moscow. Vladimir Putin calls this the vertical of power, a chain of command from Moscow to every region. However, when everything is centralized through the Kremlin, then when just one gear slips, the tremor does not stay local. The reverberations are felt across Russia. But for Vladimir Putin, this is a problem. He promised stability. He promised a new Russian empire. But today we see that he is doing no more than delivering a vassal state to China. Russia today is not being governed. It is being kept running one rushed fix at a time, making the next fix all the more expensive. The only question now is timing and sequence. Which pillar of this vertical power is going to buckle first? And what happens when a region stops playing along and Moscow cannot force it back? My name is Dr. Jason Smart. I'm a Kiev Post Special Correspondent and a National Security Advisor. Vladimir Putin is now juggling a number of urgencies all at once. In one hand, there is the Ukraine war that has turned into the bear trap for Vladimir Putin. In the other hand, there is the rapidly worsening situation inside of Russia. It could crack at any moment. But in the air is the total uncertainty as to who around him is already plotting for the post-Putin era. I've spent more than 20 years working against the Putin regime, and it's why we have this channel, to get at the truth of what's happening there. If you want to get serious briefings on what is really happening in Moscow and unvarnished truth about Russia's autocracy allies that are now planning their next big move against the West, subscribe now. Consider becoming a channel member. In Russia now, the economic death spiral is creating a fiscal hole that cannot be bridged. The Kremlin is cannibalizing its own future to pay for the present. It's using the National Wealth Fund as a desperate payday loan. Tax revenues have plunged by more than 46% from oil and gas. Now that represents a massive budgetary gap that opens a serious threat to the very foundations of the Putin regime. The budget deficit for the year is already hit almost 3% of the total economy. This figure is 500% higher than the initial projections for the year. However, despite 25 years in power, more than Joseph Stalin, Vladimir Putin never diversified the Russian economy. Liquid assets in the National Wealth Fund represent just less than 2% of GDP. Russia's National Wealth Fund is a state savings buffer, and it's meant to stabilize the budget and pensions when the oil and gas revenues fall. So if its liquid money were to hit zero tomorrow because the Kremlin has chosen to rob it in order to pay for this war, it means that we can expect that they will slash spending in the country. They will raise taxes, they'll print more money, and they'll probably be forced to borrow more, all of which will hit the living standards very fast. But today, the liquid portion is draining rapidly as federal revenues continue to collapse. Raw numbers show only $52 billion remains in the tank for the entire nation. That's about 5 weeks of federal spending at the 2025 budget pace. Analysts largely believe that Russia will use up all of the reserves before the end of the year. When you consider what a tight margin they're on right now, it's incredible that they have an uncapped military budget, spending more than 7% of GDP, taking out loans from their banks to pay for the war. You see, when you take out loans to pay for your military, it's not a great idea when you realize you'll never be able to pay it back. You're leaving large holes in your central banking system. Well, what happens tomorrow when you need that cash? Or when the citizens want to take out their money? And that's where things get tricky. That's where bank runs become a reality. But at this point, Russia's out of options. Oil is remaining incredibly low. In fact, recently they have offered India $26 a barrel for their oil. Now, when you consider all this, we see that Russia has a solvency problem, but it's not just at the national level. In fact, record domestic insolvency is spreading in Russia. There were 568,000 individuals and companies to go bankrupt in the last year. This is a 32% increase over the year before. Moscow is literally eating its own tail to stay in the fight. And when cash gets tight, the first cuts are silent. But then the silence turns physical. It becomes noticeable. It's when the heat fails, the lights fail, the transport fails. And infrastructure is the fight that the Russians are seeing today. To highlight how bad the situation is inside of Russia, consider this. Everything that you've heard that Russia is an energy superpower is a Potemkin village. The truth is this: Russians today are paying more for gasoline than the average American. Gasoline in the United States is 17% cheaper than it is inside of Russia. How is it possible that an oil kingdom does not have enough gasoline? But consider this as well. Parts of Russia today have lost electricity and heating during the harshest winter they have had in ages. In cities like Angarsk, 160,000 people were abandoned to the freezing Siberian weather. Residential areas were left without heat as temperatures hit 23 degrees below zero. That's negative 9 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, decades of systemic corruption have left the power grid in a state of total collapse. Maintenance is the invisible glue that holds a modern state together, and the Kremlin decided to melt that glue to cast more artillery for their shells. The military gets what it needs, but the people suffer, and the cannibalization of maintenance means repair budgets were diverted to cruise missiles. Freezing Siberian apartments are the physical cost of military hardware. Every missile fired at a playground is a repair that did not happen at home. However, there's another way that we can think about this. Today, we know that Ukrainians are freezing because Russia has attacked its energy and its heating. But that's because Russia is Ukraine's enemy. But inside of Russia, Russians are freezing. They lack electricity. And that's because the Kremlin is draining the maintenance budgets to fund the war. Would that not also mean that the Russian leadership is the enemy of the Russian people? But I digress. Now, Russia, of course, is not the only country to have ever gone through this pattern before. In fact, when we look back at this sort of historical pattern of losing power, we see there's a technical atrophy that comes with it. When a regime realizes its objectives are unattainable, it often turns inward. Leaders purge professional officers to perform strength before the court. Now, results disappear and the theatrics replace competence. And in fact, we see something very similar in Russia. But during the final years of the Second World War, we saw the same thing in Germany. Hitler cycled through commanders repeatedly, dismissing one and recycling the other. This all though signaled only one thing: desperation. Now, as Allied and Soviet forces closed in, Hitler blamed his generals for their betrayal. He refused to admit to a total bankruptcy of national resources. However, do you think that Vladimir Putin's regime is going to end any other way? Do you think that he will admit that he made a terrible, tragic error by launching his 3-day special military operation? It isn't quite unlikely. In fact, in early 2026, we are seeing this exact behavior play out inside of the Russian military command. Right now, the High Command is preparing to replace Admiral Sergei Pinchuk. Pinchuk has been the commander of the Black Sea Fleet, but as you've probably noticed, the Black Sea Fleet is not doing very well anymore. In fact, it is being destroyed by Ukraine, a country that lacks any sort of substantive navy. But his removal is because there's been a sequence of disastrous losses at sea, one drone strike after another. And after each firing, though, the Kremlin demands a miracle from the next man. Nobody can speak truth to power and say that the government had no plan when it got into this. It decided to launch a war, never thinking that somebody might strike back, that the bully will be stood up to. But today, that is happening. But for Russia, it means something else. For Admiral Pinchuk, it is merely the latest firing in a long, long line of sacrificial lambs. So for Russia today, the situation gets worse. When you're replacing your commanders left and right, and your soldiers realize that their leaders don't understand what's happening, it doesn't create a lot of faith in the military leadership. It also creates a military that is operating under pressure. Officers who are going to choose safe optics over risky truth. And this churn leads to terribly stupid mistakes. Look at all the propaganda videos that Russia's military pumps out. They send men into Ukraine, sabotage groups, just to demonstrate that there are men inside of Ukraine. They come around with flags and they claim they've taken over villages. Those men, all the time, get liquidated. But the Russians keep doing it. Why would they send men to die just to take a photo that's quickly disproven, showing that they took a village that's not under control? It's because that is all the senior leadership of the Russian military can come up with today. They have no better plan of what to do inside of Ukraine. But for Russia, it's not going to get any better. Look at the attack that we just saw on the short-range air defense designed to kill drones and low-flying aircraft near Lugansk. It was a Tor M1. This sort of specialized equipment is not easy for Russia to get more of. In fact, it lacks it. Or look at the attack on the OSA SA-8. That system near Zaporizhia, it's very important for the Russians. It is used to shield the troops in key sites. Without this layer, high value positions become exposed and harder to hold. It also means you can be sure that now Ukraine will attack more. We were watching how $500 drones can destroy $50 million hardware parts. And what's incredible is that the ROI is so good. But more than that is the fact that Russia cannot do anything about it. Russia can replace meat waves, its soldiers, but it cannot replace radar technicians. It cannot replace the high end microchips required to build new units. Which reminds me to check out the first pinned comment below with a question of the day and a video that you should also really check out. But right below that, see how you too can help the Ukrainian soldiers get what they need to defeat Russia. All donations right now are being matched. Thank you. Today we are witnessing how international isolation is turning Russia into a vassal state. Vladimir Putin had claimed it had a great number of allies around the world ready to support his illegal invasion of Ukraine. But today it doesn't seem like those friends remember him anymore. Allies like China and Iran behave much more like predatory lenders than like partners. China is forcing deep discounts in everything it trades with Russia. But accepting Chinese geopolitical dominance is the only remaining price of survival that Vladimir Putin can pay. Frontline failures are merging with systemic failures at home. The vertical of power is losing its grip, region by region and ministry by ministry. So today we see that Russia is no longer an empire. It is a distressed asset for its neighbors to buy. The buffers built over a quarter of a century are finally gone, and the system no longer can absorb the shocks. Today, Vladimir Putin is not buying victory. He is simply buying time, and that is running out. Check out this video so you see what's next. Thank you, as always, for supporting Ukraine.